Hi, welcome to the Townsend Center. My name's Stephen Best. I'm director of the Townsend Center. I'm a professor in the Department of English. We're pleased to host Claire Kahane, professor emerita at the University of Buffalo and a visiting scholar in the Berkeley English Department. Claire trained in psychoanalysis at the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute and served as an instructor at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. And she also received her PhD here at UC Berkeley in the Department of English. She's here to discuss her recent memoir, 9 Lives, My Risky Road from 50s Rebel to Feminist Critic. And joining Claire is my colleague, Elizabeth Abel, professor emerita in the English department. It's exciting to have two major figures in feminist literary criticism as part of our book chats series this spring. A few coming events of note. Our next book chat will take place next Wednesday, October 1st, when Marty J. will join us to discuss his recent book, Magical Nominalism, the Historical Event, Aesthetic Reenchantment, and the Photograph. Marty will be in conversation with Peng Chia of the Rhetoric Department. And then later in October, the Townsend Center will host the psychoanalyst Avgi Sakatopoulou as our 2025 Avenali lecturer. The lecture, Fighting Fire with Fire, Aesthetics, Exigent Sadism, Insurgency, will take place on Monday, October 6th in the Mod 5 room over in the English department. And on October 7th, Sakatopoulou will be in conversation with our colleagues Damon Young, Paola Bacchetta, and Eric Stanley. So Claire, welcome back to Berkeley. We're really happy to host you. I look forward to your conversation.
Thank you. I had planned to start with saying just a few words about Claire's background and how she came to this memoir, but Stephen has covered some of it, so I'll just supplement it in a few ways. First, by just mentioning the titles of some of Claire's academic work, her scholarship in feminist criticism and theory. First, I'd like to juxtapose the memoir and its title with one of her major works, which was called Passions of the Voice, Hysteria, Narrative, and the Figure of the Speaking Woman. We'll revisit this juxtaposition in a couple of minutes, and then to mention a couple of the other titles that were extremely influential in the development of feminist psychoanalysis. The edited or co-edited volumes in Doris Case, Freud, Hysteria, Feminism, and The Mother Tongue, Essays in Feminist Psychoanalytic Interpretation. And I thought I would just add to that a more personal note of when and how Claire and I first met, which was at the conference on the creative use of difference in 1980 that she organized and really individually constructed and created at SUNY Buffalo at that time. It was a path-breaking, really memorable event at which a rising generation of feminist scholars came together really for the first time to talk about their interest in gender and psychoanalysis and literature. But perhaps what I remember most vividly were not the public talks and conversations, but the offstage arguments, quarrels, jockeying for position, including a memorable moment when one conference attendee threw her cigarette lighter at another, and that has been engraved in my memory. And so to sort of set up the issue of the question of what can be said publicly, what can be done or said privately, what the relation between these two spheres are, especially as the feminist movement began to claim the personal as a legitimate sphere of inquiry that had political and theoretical implications. So for you, Claire, I wanted to ask what it was like for you to make this transition from scholarship to memoir, from the public voice to a more personal, private one, how much carryover there was or wasn't, whether the memoir writing put pressure on or called into question any of the theoretical assumptions that we made, whether the theory informed the writing of the memoir, or just to talk with us a little about that process.
Well, that's a very large,
Yes.
very large question. I'll start out with what still is my most intense memory of writing, which is trying to get rid of my academic voice and trying to write in a trade book voice, a conversational voice, a voice that wouldn't put off the general reader. We know that we all live in different bubbles, and my closest friend in New York can't read my writing, because my academic writing, because she doesn't know what I'm talking about. She doesn't understand the separate discourse, and certainly the discourse that was prominent in the late 70s and through the 80s, as, for example, psychoanalysis became more a humanities discourse than a psychology department discourse, with all of the, and as Lacanian theory entered the university. So I had to really learn to write in another voice. And I recall now there was an academic book called In a Different Voice. What was her name?
Was that Carol Gilligan?
Yes, Carol Gilligan. It's certainly, but that's not what she meant. She meant writing in a, well, actually, might be related, writing as a woman as opposed to writing as the universal ego, I, which was always in the pronoun he, identified with the male voice as a general writing voice. So, so that's true. I had to write as a woman, but not a woman in any theoretical sense as I started writing, but just trying to relate my experience living as a woman in an ordinary voice that would nevertheless arouse interest. So that was a real education. And in writing and rewriting, and of course, rewriting is always the most important part of writing in a way, as acts of writing. I found myself, looking at a paragraph and saying, no, this is too academic, and throwing it out. And that, in a way, led me to the voice that I use, or the voices that I use in the book, because I start the book as a 5-year-old, with my experience as a 5-year-old, and I did not have any critical look at what I was saying or thinking. And what I decided was to do each chapter in the voice of who I was at that time. And since the memoir is written chronologically, that is, I was 5 years old, it starts in 1940, and it ends pretty much in 1911. I mean, sorry, I may feel that
Where
way,
your
but
head
no.
is, yeah. Mine too.
2011. The chapters each try to write in a voice of the person that I was without any critical feedback on who I was at the time. So in a way, the earlier chapters may be less interesting in terms of their complexity, unless you're a psychoanalytic critic. But the book shows a kind of developmental line without saying it by the voice in each phase until 2011.
Would you say it's a female voice or a feminine voice?
Definitely.
I mean, it's about female experience, but is the voice itself gendered?
I think the voice itself is gendered by, a voice speaks, and it's gendered in terms of what is said. And you and I were talking a little bit earlier about this, but I'll bring it up now. very early in my child experience, I wrote about feeling nervous walking around in the dark on the streets. And throughout the book, there's a kind of shadow of unsafety, possible, risk. The shadow of risk, which starts early, but becomes increasingly gendered as I get older. The risk initially is the risk that a cat will go for my throat when I'm sleeping, which was something my mother told me when I was 2, 3, 4, that cats go for your throat when you're sleeping. And so I was terrified of cats until I started reading. And I read a book called Puss in Boots. And I loved it. And I loved the emphasis on travel and adventure. And the Puss in Boots was a male cat, but I identified with that desire to just have boots that can take me miles and miles away, each step a giant step. And that was one of the elements in the book that made me feel maybe attracted to the notion of the cat who could jump, who had 9 lives, who was smart but elusive. You couldn't actually tell what the cat was thinking. It's very independent. So all the features that we associate with cats, I began to sort of take as a kind of ideal ego, if you will, in psychoanalytic terms, which I don't use in the book, so none of that. So the original question, I've already forgotten.
Well, the relation of your theoretical discourse and formation
right.
to the personal voice.
So I really had to learn how to write in ordinary language that was conversational, that nevertheless carried a note of who I was as a person, and made the text available to the general reader rather than to a very particular class. So
you mentioned shadows, so I thought this is from the memoir, if you wanted to. So this is Claire, what age do you think you are here?
I'm 23.
With your rucksack and your guitar, all that you need for this adventure. And then the projection of shadows and what those shadow selves might be.
Well, the shadow self of me and my guitar, which which was an image, a self-image that I really loved at the time. I loved traveling with my guitar. I had learned to play in college, and when I traveled, I took this guitar with me, which I had bought in Mexico on a totally other trip years before this. And so the shadow self of me and my guitar is the notion of, well, it's a note, I'm not sure I can really explain it, but what's important for me in this, I mean, I saw myself as a performer, a traveler, an adventurous. This is a photo on the road, on the Riviera Road outside of Cannes, France. But the photo was taken by the male shadow to the right. And that male shadow is an important figure in the photograph and in my experience too, because I was posing for the male shadow as well as projecting myself as a figure, a wandering minstrel, if you will, in this photograph. So the shadow of the wandering minstrel with the backpack, but that being taken by or being somehow possessed by a male gaze.
Right. And do you think that male gaze had also been internalized by you? In other words, is there a, are you incorporating that male gaze?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I tried to actually be in the position, not only of the figure whose photograph is being taken, i.e. the passive object of the photograph, but to be in the position of the person who is creating that figure.
And as the writer, of course, you are.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll come back to the cat in a minute. But this was a passage, maybe a little too long, from Passions of the Voice. Okay? And it's especially the second paragraph. The first one is kind of familiar, you know, the masculine nature of the quest narrative subject. But then you get to the newly emergent figure of the speaking woman as an articulate, desiring subject. Her appearance casts doubt not only on the inevitability of this plot, but also on the very laws of sexual difference that constituted it. The figure of the woman with a potent voice augured a sexual anarchy in representation that threatened the narrator's ability to tell a coherent story.
Oh, that's nice. I haven't seen this book.
And I wonder if now, when you're talking about your oscillation, perhaps, between the male gaze and the female subject of it or object of it, you are in effect enacting this instability
Yes.
that the figure of the speaking woman introduces into the narrative.
Yes, yes. An instability that had cultural consequences, not just for me, but for the culture at large. Very much related, I think, to the rise of modernism.
Interesting. And just one more, perhaps, before we get to the cat. Here's, by the way, the actual version of the motorcycle in the trip, which is the.
This is when I first bought it. I went to Genoa to buy it at the factory, and I rode it off the factory floor, packed with all my gear, which made it very heavy, so that when I had trouble holding it upright whenever I got off it. But once I was on it, and there's a nice metaphor there.
Really?
Once I was on it, I went, and I loved this Vespa. I even took it, even had it sent back to this country at the end of that year in Europe.
So just, it's not the Vespa, but this is a photograph from some other moment or.
Yeah, well, that photograph was taken by the same person that took the photograph.
I see.
I had been riding in the sidecar of this motorcycle that belonged to someone who was giving me a ride, someone in Barcelona, where I started this trip to get my Vespa. And he was going as far as Cannes. And so we got off, and I got off in Cannes. And, but before I got off, I wanted to see what it felt like to drive something. I hadn't yet gotten the Vespa. And so he got in the sidecar, and I drove the motorcycle for a couple of miles, and I realized it was I had something too powerful between my legs, and I couldn't control it.
Why does that sound familiar?
And so I stopped and said, let me get back in the sidecar. This is too powerful. The Vespa was just my size.
I'm also struck by the subtitles of these two works, especially of the memoir, My Risky Road, from 50s Rebel to Feminist Critic, the metaphor of the road. And you mentioned Kerouac's On the Road in the prologue, I think. And so I guess I'm wondering, as opposed to the voice, which is obviously an instrument of subjectivity more than the road is. And so that play between the inner and the outer and the feminized and the masculine, and
Huh,
what role
that's interesting. I hadn't
Kerouac
thought
might have
about that.
played.
So the 9 lives and the notion of being on the road was a metaphor that I hadn't thought of as a metaphor, of course, but I had a very powerful desire to travel. And when I finished undergraduate school, I started traveling on the road, and it was around the time that Kerouac's book had come out. And actually, one chapter takes place in San Francisco because I lived during the in 1956, 57 in North Beach in San Francisco, and frequented Vesuvio's, which was very different then than it is now, unfortunately. But so that notion of traveling, being on the road, dominated my consciousness for many years. Some might say too many years, but many years. And it wasn't until I was in my early, let's say around 40, that I began to think that I needed to get off the road for a while because I had partly I was a graduate student in Berkeley for 13 years, and I was very happy in that position. But that was becoming no longer possible. The department said, okay, you better get out of here. And so I had to think about getting a position somewhere because I was of an age where it wasn't as easy to be on the road. And certainly Berkeley was forcing me to get an academic position. I was a PhD student, obviously, at that time. That book, though, is all about the desire to be on the road, and even the memoir, the recent memoir, and the way in which I attempted at least some link to that position, that subject position of the traveling on the road person, even when I lived in Berkeley and then after being a graduate student, taught in Buffalo, which at the time, Buffalo at the time was the Berkeley of the East, they called it. And it was a marvelous department when I entered it, full of wonderful writers, all male. But it had its own psychoanalytic section of the English department, which I joined because by that time I'd become a psychoanalytic critic. Anyway, Passions of the Voice, on the other hand, was a book written when I was a graduate student. Is that right? No, what am I talking about? When I had, when I was forced by my Buffalo department, that's why I felt like a graduate student. I was an associate professor. They wanted me to be a full professor. All my writings, once I entered the University at Buffalo, were articles. I wrote an article a year. I had 30 articles, or whatever it was, 20 some odd articles. They wanted a book in order for me to become a tenured professor. I was a tenured associate professor. And so I looked over my readings and found the theme that ran through most of my writings and decided that that would become the book that would get me a full professorship, Notions of the Voice, because I saw how many of my articles had to do with voice and the kind of voice and the gendered voice and the universal voice and all of that. So that book really came out of a compulsion by my department for me to write a book. And that's why it has that more static quality, I guess.
Does it? In your view? I mean, I don't see it that way.
Oh, well, I think of it as really, I say static quality because all of the chapters were things that I had talked about in different ways in different articles in the past.
Okay.
So it didn't have a future forward brand new thrust, although the articles were, but I mean, it all depended on work and thinking
Julie
and
done.
everything that I had already done. So it was like, okay, let's collect your thinking over the years as an associate professor and turn it into a book, and that will make you a professor. And
So is
it-
the memoir then liberation from that kind of external coercive professional
yeah,
drive? Yeah.
in a way, yes, I guess it is, because yes, um, I mean, writing has always been idealized, obviously, by me joining a literature department. I mean, that was the figure of the artist as writer was the figure that I most valued. And one of the impulses to become a feminist critic was to make sure that women's writing got the same kind of attention and idealization, which I think is important, as male writing, rather than being discarded as sort of frivolous or trivial or something.
So that brings me a little to the cat. So we, first of all, guess on the table of sort of on top of the table of contents, in other words, having some dominant relation to it. And then this is the epigraph, and if you haven't read it yet. And then this icon of the black cat comes at the end of every chapter, just to explain. So the cat and the motorcycle, or I'm trying to think through that relationship because the cat is also a traditional figure of domesticity, of the feminine. The cat maybe strays, but also is domesticated, is in the home. And do you see the cat as gendered, and how do you put it together with the road? The cat does not go on the road usually.
Well, actually, the cat tries to go on the road a lot.
Maybe so.
My cat went on the road. I had a black cat when I lived in Berkeley as a graduate student. Blackie was his name. He was a giant black, long-haired black cat, and he was my cat.
So what about this proverb?
So I mean, the
Yeah, go ahead.
proverb. Yeah, I mean, it seemed to divide my life in the way that my life took shape. So that when I look at the chapters of the book, I mean, it's 9 lives, 9 chapters, and the first 3 are me playing, and then I mean, really, this really is a description of the way in which the book works. And the last 3 are me taking myself more seriously as a scholar, as a mother, as a wife. I had then ensnared myself into staying. And so the travel of the strays and the plays took place only at academic conferences. And those of you that go to academic conferences know there's a lot of playing and straying at those conferences. But the bulk of my life was domestic.
And do you see that as an advance or as a decline or as a predetermined given narrative of women's lives that we end up in place. What do you make of that?
Well, I didn't end up in place. I left my marriage once my son went off to college. So
So you don't stay
I
entirely.
don't stay. As a matter of fact, several years into my marriage, I started wanting to leave it. It didn't fit my notion of what a true marriage should be. I still had romantic notions about that. And I married because I got pregnant and decided it was time to marry. But, and my husband was a wonderful man, really good looking, smart, all kinds of good things, responsible. And I married, but after several years, which are all certain dramatic things that happened in the course of my marriage, which if you buy my book, you'll find out about. For my sabbatical, I came to Berkeley and went to see my former analyst to decide whether I was going to stay in the marriage or leave it. And 6 months later, my husband came out and courted me anew, and I stayed. But there were all kinds of dramatic conflicts in the course of my marriage. And at a certain point, I left with remaining a friend with my husband and I remained friends, but he lived in Buffalo and I moved to Berkeley. So in a sense, I didn't stay.
Mhm.
I stayed for a while.
You might amend that with the parenthetical for a while. At the end.
Well, 27 years, that's quite a while.
Yeah, with some interruptions.
With some interruptions.
You know, one of the passages that struck me, it's an epigraph. So every chapter has an epigraph. And this one came as a surprise to me because I hadn't seen it before. It's from Virginia Woolf. And it goes, growing up is losing some illusions in order to acquire others. And I wonder, you know, so is staying an illusion, or is, you know, or does it carry more weight? In other words, do you see a developmental story here towards greater self-knowledge, greater wisdom, or not?
This is interesting because we haven't talked about this at all. This is totally surprise. All these questions are a surprise to me. We talked about other things. Do I think growing up is an illusion? Yes, I guess I do. I don't know if illusion is exactly the right word, but in a sense, perhaps because as a hysteric, I see my life in many senses as a series of performances. And I think of the performance of domesticity as a wife or not as, I mean, I am now in a domestic relationship and I'm a partner. I like that better than being a wife. And I like it better because there are no legal obligations to it. So it's all a question of desire. But it is, I think of it as a role, as more than a role, actually. I think I'm going to take back what I just said. See, I'm still forming my thoughts. I think of the book as a developmental narrative in that each chapter, which the book goes chronological, is structured chronologically, each chapter shows me at a particular place at a particular time in terms of my mental attitude and my interests. And they get more complex as the book develops. And in the last 3 chapters, I feel that I have developed a kind of complexity that wasn't all play anymore, or straying, or adventure seeking, and really, really delve into the notion of responsibility, self-responsibility, and responsibility to others. And that was a big movement for me. Not that I was irresponsible, but I never took it as seriously when I was younger as I began to take it actually once I had a child. Once I had a child, that was a transformative experience for me in that, as I say in the memoir, for the first time in my life, I thought I would give up my life for his. I had never thought that about anyone before, including my parents. But I would give up my life for his. And that sense of responsibility at the edge just was a transformational moment, a transformational consciousness. And so that was development, a real developmental change. Although I had a long way to go, and in those last chapters, I describe my psychoanalysis in great part, and the things that sometimes comic, sometimes not so comic, incidents as a result of being in psychoanalysis.
So maybe that's a good moment to open this up to questions from the audience. So I see Wendy has a question.
Claire, once you and I were having a conversation, you might be in the middle of your memoir. Oh, thank you. You might have been in the middle of your memoir. I'm not sure which phase, but I said, you know, memoir is challenging partly because sometimes it's difficult to really remember accurately a given situation or a given moment or incident or whatever. I was thinking of myself. Sometimes I remember half of what happened really clearly, or I think it's half of what happened, but the rest is a little fuzzy or didn't know what. And I said, what do you do in those situations? And you said, well, you make it up. And I thought that was a very interesting question and continues to be in the light of all the controversy about memoir. And I wonder if you could reflect further on this in the context of your memoir and memoir in general.
Yeah, that is a good question. And in a sense, the whole memoir is made up. Memory itself, by its very nature, is a composition of fragments. Most people have different memories of the same event. So it's all a kind of subjective composition to try to capture the truth of the experience, the emotional truth of the experience, the figures involved in that, and the basic facts of the incident. And that gets composed and filled in by invention. How do you put it all together? Because like memory in the brain, it's here, there, that, there, and then you have to put it together. And that's where the act of invention comes in. And memoir is literature, right? And literature, it's not journalism, as a friend of mine would say, it's literature. Journalism can't put it together and then make sense of it through invention, except, well, some articles do, but some politicians do, of course. But literature is composition, and it's the difference is memoir is composition based on memory of things that happened that had a particular emotional theme to it or point to it. So for example, and mine, I make up conversations that are meant to show the relationship I was having at that time in this room, in this space with that person. I don't have the words. I did, um, I did keep journals. I didn't look at them much. I looked at them a little bit, but even the journal, you know, gives you a kind of skeleton of where you were that day and what happened. And then I filled in to create a narrative that captured for a reader. I tried to anyway, whether I did it is something else, but try to capture for a reader the emotional truth of that experience, which is what literature is all about, to capture an emotional truth or recognition in language. And language has its limitations too. If you've ever tried to write down a dream, and I have tried many times in the course of an analysis, especially when I was in Jungian analysis, you know that you're not really capturing the factual experience of the dream. You're capturing some sense of it and you're putting it together so that you can make sense of it. But you always know that whatever you've written down is not exactly what the dream was. And that's memory. And the dream is a good example when you try to write down a dream and you write it as a narrative in linear form. And then at the same time, then. And so I guess that's my answer.
Science about what can memory actually capture. And, people who are professionals in regard to eyewitnesses find out that a lot of the time they're wrong. One says the card's red, the other says it's green, someone else says yellow.
Right.
Yeah.
Claire, I was interested in your comment on how different the academic voice is from the memoir voice. And as you were describing your decision to suppress the academic voice, I was thinking of other memoirs recently written by prominent academic women. I think of Avril Cameron's Transitions. I think of Drew Faust's Necessary Trouble. And I don't think that either of them made that decision at all. And I'm wondering whether or not you've engaged other memoirs by academics, particularly academic women, who have made the choice that you have or who have chosen differently.
That's a good question. Thank you for that. I haven't read any academic memoirs other than a few by friends of mine. But I did make the choice that I wanted to write for the general reader. And in particular, I wanted to write for a friend who can't read academic discourse. She says, I can't read it. I just can't read it. I wanted her to read, to be able to read what I wrote. I took her as a kind of general reader. So I did make the decision not to use an academic voice. Now, there are parts, a couple of paragraphs here and there, very occasional, because part of the memoir deals with my work, and my work was academic. So I do have some small sections of it in which I try to describe the essence of an article I just wrote that had some bearing on the experience, a personal experience I just had, and turned it into a literary critique of a writer. So there is some academic writing, but in it toward the end, because I wanted to put my academic self in there in some way, but it had to relate to the very personal things I was talking about. But yes, you're right. I have not, other than a few friends who have written memoirs who are academics, I haven't read any spate of them.
I think you'd find Drew Faust's autobiography very interesting in this regard, of the decisions that she made to talk about growing up in a reactionary, almost slave-oriented family in Virginia, to her various books about race and American history.
Ah.
I think you'd find it interesting.
What's the title of it?
Necessary Trouble by the president of Harvard, Drew Faust.
I should write that
I'll
down
give
too.
it to you.
Okay.
Other,
Can I borrow your pen?
yeah.
Hi, my name is Justice, and I'm a first year in the English PhD program here, and I do some work on Flannery O'Connor, on psychoanalysis and the grotesque, which is how I came across some of this stuff you've written before, some of the academic stuff, I mean. And when I saw this event, I knew I really wanted to come by, especially considering how I've just gotten back from a year sort of hitchhiking around Europe myself. And I thought, well, I have to see what this is about. But my question is about Flannery O'Connor and something you said just now about idealizing some women writers. Considering how Flannery O'Connor is extremely unfashionable, I feel these days with the way she's gathering a lot of negative attention for her racism, for her ugliness, for her grotesqueness, or something like that. How do you feel about squaring that with idealization? Something great, but also something terrible at the same time.
Well, I love Flannery O'Connor's writings. She was the subject of my dissertation. And actually, there's been a whole Flannery O'Connor renaissance that's centered around her estate in Milledgeville with conferences and books and things coming out. So she still figures as an important writer. I was drawn to her because of the way in which she used the grotesque, the way in which her humor, which was subtle and vicious and very funny, entered her texts. Her racism, um, I excused at the time. I haven't read what people are saying now, but I excused at the time in the same way that she excused it by saying she couldn't imagine the interior of the Black people she knew. And so she could only represent them by the exterior that they showed to her, which was self-consciously a caricature toward a white audience in order to protect themselves. They put on the mask of the Black man, the Black woman, in order to keep their own identity and their own community inviolate. So she said that she could just present them as these stereotypes that they presented themselves as. So I accepted that at the time. More has come out. She was a Southerner. I'm sure she had all the biases of a Southerner, although I think she did try to keep them down. And in one of her stories, The Artificial Nigger, she portrays the strongest character in that is the Black woman, who the white Southerners run away from because they're fearful of her. So in that story, which I've written about, they run away from all that their Black neighbors are represented to them. They were terribly afraid. And she represents that in a way that's a brilliant story. But of course, I don't think anybody reads it now because of the title. But that was a decision on her part, the artificial niggers, that is, wearing the mask of servility at a time when that was how they were able to get along until that broke. But she was conservative, certainly. She was, in many ways, a traditionalist. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I still think her writing is fabulous.
Yeah, no, the part in her letters to her friends when she talks about not having the audacity to try to go inside their heads the way some other writers do was something that also stuck out to me when I was researching and so on. But the new revelations about like her personal letters that were uncensored and published, where she's being sort of casually, cruelly racist, not just in her fiction, but it just
Yeah.
seems like for fun
Well,
or something.
all I can say is, I think T.S. Eliot is a brilliant writer, and he was anti-Semitic to the very hilt. And I'm Jewish. So, and Ezra Pound. I mean, you think about all the anti-Semites in modernism. But they produced incredible writing. And so I am one who looks at the writing rather than the writer. What comes out is important.
Yeah, no, I feel that. I mean, you can just go down the line: Rembrandt, Caravaggio, Faulkner, whatever. These guys aren't
Yeah.
not good
Yeah.
people. But it's hard to put into words why I feel that it's still worth studying. But thank you.
Do we have to stop 1 minute? One more?
Did your son read your memoir? And while you were writing it, did you think about your son, your ex-husband, your parents, all the people who might be reading it?
I certainly did. Yes, I did. Well, my ex-husband, my former husband, died in 1911. The memoir actually,
2011. 2011.
oh, I'm sorry, I said that again. In 2011, right, 2011, the 21st century now, right, 2011. I end the memoir at his funeral, and which I thought was why I chose to do that. I've never totally formulated, but he was a obviously very important figure. And in my representation of him, I thought of my son reading it. I did not want to say anything about him, if possible, that would reduce his image in the eyes of my son. So my son, I was more worried about because he's still alive. But I did, I think, temper what I said about my son because I thought he might read it. On the other hand, there's a scene in the memoir, which is a scene of rape. I was raped, that I did not want my son to read, but I felt I had to put it in because there's such a shadow of rape that runs through a lot of the memoir until it actually happened. I didn't want him to read that. And so I told him, I said, don't read, pages, da, 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 da. Of course, what would that do? Right. Immediately, I thought of Bluebeard. Don't open that door. I don't know if he's read it. I gave him a copy when I said, don't read, da, 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 da. But I had to, I did try to temper what I said with him in mind, but I did not exclude too much. That was the only scene that I didn't temper and that I worried about how he would respond. He's very sensitive. So.
I think we need to stop. The lights are going out. So thank everybody for coming.
Thank you.